Okay, so I can see that we have quite a few people coming in. So we can start this session. So thanks a lot, everyone, for coming today. This is a Black History Month webinar, which is co-organized by the Institute of Development Studies and the British Library of Development Studies. I would like to extend a special thanks to James Andrews, who has organized this event. Dionodor Wanji, who is a research officer at IDS, and myself will be co-chairing this event. And this event very much follows discussions that have been happening across the Institute. The Institute of Development Studies, there was the Decolonize IDS Student Manifesto, the Decolonize IDS Working Group, and a range of initiatives and discussions. And the idea of this webinar is very much to keep these discussions alive. So this webinar is entitled Decolonizing Development, Imagining Otherwise. And the idea today is to explore the ways in which development perpetuates coloniality, while also aiding the reproduction of Western colonialist and orientalist views of Afro-Caribbean histories, communities, and pedagogies. We know that discourses and representations are not neutral, and particularly so in development, where they have wide-ranging political, economic, and societal impacts. And these discourses and representations can embed worldviews and ideas that have colonial or otherwise problematic origins, particularly with regards to Afro-Caribbean communities and histories. So as guiding questions for our discussions today, the idea is to think about how we can identify and think critically about what discourses and representations which have colonial origins development continues to carry today, and how can development move beyond this problematic colonial legacy. So our first speaker today is Melz Owusu, whom I would like to thank for joining us today. Melz Owusu is an academic, an activist, a spiritualist, and the director of the Free Black University. They are currently conducting a PhD at the University of Cambridge, and will be speaking today about the coloniality of development. Our second speaker today is Daniel Millam, who is a project officer who works on the British Library of Development Studies, which is quite an exceptional archive of the history of development thought and development research. And Daniel has been exploring and cataloging this archive and thinking about how the archive can be used to explore this history of problematic ideas, and how the archive can be used to contribute to these current discussions on decolonization. So without further ado, I would like to pass to Melz Owusu, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll just get straight into my talk, Decolonizing Development, Imagining Otherwise. Firstly, I want to make it clear that I do not believe development can be decolonized. So why do I believe this? The way I perceive it, development as a project is deeply related to the concept of time. In both theory and practice, the overarching assumption that is made through discourses of development is that time exists on a linear matrix. Therefore, this distinction between developed countries and underdeveloped countries suggests that there is almost a divine point of narrative progression that every country should undergo to reach an idealized point of development. And so the question here then is, who designs this linear matrix of time that places underdeveloped countries as behind in time and developed countries as ahead in time? So I want to move the conversation away from considering how we may further develop underdeveloped countries to create an equal playing field, and instead consider an analysis of development itself as an inherent tool of white supremacy. I've believed for a long time that development is a method and practice of shaping multiple forms of modernity that mirror the West, and therefore gives very little space to critique the foundations of the West itself. What many of the values that underpin development discourse may seem almost undeniably humane. Sorry. All we need to do, though, is look at developed countries and recognize the inhumanity that still resides within the systems that we conceive of and consider developed. A Latin American decolonial theorist called Walter Mignolo wrote an article entitled "The Enduring Enchantment of the Epistemic Privilege of Modernity and Where to Go from Here." In this article, Mignolo explored the formations of the space-time matrix as a tool of Western modernity. In this, he argues that in the European Renaissance, people were seen on a spatial matrix, and therefore otherness was defined spatially. Whereas into the Enlightenment period, Mignolo argues that a temporal matrix was inserted into the imagination of Western philosophy. And the purpose of this temporal matrix was to position Europe as the center and as present in time, the newly discovered or even invented Northern America as the future, and all others behind in time. For me, this is a very apt explanation of discourses of development. They work under the assumption that time is a societal fact, and therefore progression upon this matrix of time is one, positive, and two, that time is universal. But as Mignolo also explores in this piece, and as has been stated by a number of theorists, time itself is a product of Eurocentrism. This is an idea I think is a very powerful one. The constraints of time as being a product of the Western imagination gives us fertile ground for theorizing a number of concerning elements of modernity. I've recently been reading a lot more of disability theory and the concept of crip time, as defined by Ellen Samuels, struck me as a brilliant way to and lens through which we can critique progression, capitalism, and modernity as a whole. Crip time is the idea that we might bend the clock to meet the minds and bodies of disabled people, as opposed to forcing the universal concept of time onto bodies and people who are not at times able to meet the demands of time within this society based on productivity and capitalism. So what happens if we were to bend the clock here and aim not to meet these presupposed ideas of modernity, but instead to meet all those who exist outside the normative Eurocentric masculinist body where they are at? I'm also interested in what happens when we stop considering modernity to have been in part good and in part bad. This is sometimes characterized as the dark side of modernity or the underside of modernity. What if instead we said that there is no dark or no light of modernity? Therefore, there is no light side for which development may sit. And therefore, what may be considered the light of modernity is less so a light and more so a veneer or a facade that both legitimizes and upholds aspects of modernity and development that we would collectively reject. So again, where do we go from here? Firstly, I think it's important to recognize that prior to colonization, many communities across the global South had their own knowledge systems and ways of living. This is often eclipsed from our narratives and is testament to the epistemicide that coloniality continues to enforce. Within these knowledges, whole societies were thriving. One example I like to reflect upon when considering development and pre-colonial societies is the climate. Right across the global south, many knowledge systems were based within spirituality. And key to many of these spiritualities is a deep reverence of nature. Nature is something that is very important to me. And I've recently written about its importance and spiritual connection at a personal level in a book that's been published by Penguin Press called Black Joy, which you're all free to check out. But here, I want to bring your attention to the fact that we are currently living in a climate emergency or a climate crisis or whatever we decide to name it. And this climate crisis is a product of Eurocentrism. It is a product of capitalism, and it is a product of development. Had these pre-colonial communities not been told that their knowledge systems were worthless due to them not meeting scientific standards and therefore were in need of development, I truly believe that we would not be in a climate crisis that we are in today. Imagine a world in which we did not see nature as just a commodity for our consumption, but instead we saw land and seas for the divinity that they hold. How would that affect the way we extract, the way we dispose, the way we prioritize what has been, the way we prioritize, sorry, I'm dyslexic, I can't even read my own writing. And the ways that we hold and consider development. And please don't get me wrong. It's not just overdevelopment that is a problem. It is the concept of development itself. We are in a society that has become insatiable with progression along this timeline. Earlier, I asked who sculpts the timeline, and it is, of course, colonial countries or the global north. And therefore, this timeline is still within a narrative and a knowledge system where coloniality, neo-coloniality, racism, and all forms of oppression are rampant. And whilst the veneers may hide some of the most harmful elements of development, it is incumbent on us all to stay suspicious and explore the ways that harm continues to be enacted on various people and bodies in the name of development. As mentioned, we are all living within the Western imagination. It is an imagination in which, regardless of how much development takes place, the global South will forever be behind in time. Even with the logics of the society in which we live, if you were to start a race and place some of the contenders miles behind the person at the front, we would all say that it's an injustice. But so long as we hold on to development as the tool through which to remedy global problems, we are essentially setting up many to fail. So what then can we do? My answer is always to imagine. To use the parts of our minds as well as our hearts and souls to think of different possibilities. This idea of radical imagination is what throughout time has allowed us to supersede many impossibilities. The radical Black imagination, as characterized by Robin D.G. Kelley in his seminal text, Freedom Dreams, argues that Black people throughout time have had to imagine the impossible to be at the stage of liberation that we are at. And in this moment too, we must imagine what may seem impossible. What may it mean to dream beyond this linear matrix of time, to twist and bend and sculpt new visions of collective liberation that are not just based within the material world and within capitalism? How do we complicate agency and knowledge systems in a way that might allow us to see something that we may have never seen before, when considering how to make the world a better place? I don't have all the solutions, but what I do implore each and every one of you to do today is almost suspend yourself in reality, to release all constraints and confines of the Western Academy, all the limitations of the ways we have been taught to think, the parameters that have been placed around what we can consider as possible. From this space, we may begin to see something different. We may find alternative possibilities, but that is only if we are brave enough to dream. Thank you.
I guess it's my turn now, and I will start by thanking Melz really greatly for this talk and the points raised. And frankly, I must say I was a bit pleased to see this frankness, and I would say maybe an element of radicality just at the start of your presentation in stating that development cannot be colonized. And I was actually waiting to see how we were going to support the argument, which you've done, I think, very well in especially in raising the issue of time and especially the who has the jurisdiction over, determining which time to point at being a phase of development or not. And I can illustrate this by, the experience of this meeting. For me, I'm sitting here in Cameroon, in a, rural area of Cameroon, where I was about 20 years ago. And I'm holding a meeting with people in 10,000 miles away from me. 20 years ago, this was not possible here in Cameroon. And I'm sure 20 years ago, this was not possible in England as well. But that, because you were underdeveloped. So this is just to support the point you've raised, and one important point as well that you've brought up, and which I think is important, is the trap, the sense of trap that colonization, first of all, brought people into, is to say that maybe we have a good side to colonialism and then a bad side, which you've reflected upon by dark, light and dark. Modern I says that we come to a point where certain values that I would say could be shared by all humans. Colonialism, if we say no development, and then when there's a catastrophe somewhere or a disaster somewhere, then the human nature is that you need to assist the other person, whether it's happening in Malaysia, in France, or in Cameroon. And I think this is where the notion of development takes a form that is understandable to everybody, and then later on could be hijacked by the past that bears colonial elements. And I wanted to kind of link what you've said to the research I had done for my PhD at the border between Cameroon, Nigeria, and the three-part border between Cameroon, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. You can see that in this context, for example, there are specific development projects that looked at both the communities, be it on environmental issues, on security, or other forms of transnational issues. But if you look at these projects, how they're conceptualized, how they are actually envisioned in terms of outcome, nobody is considering the border itself as a problem. And the borders in Africa are inherited from colonization. And when you observe, you spend time with these people living around these border areas, they tell you the amount of biographical disruptions that the border brings to their lives. And yet, all development projects miss this point, which brings me back to the point that development can be decolonized only if it decides to look at other values, other knowledges, other vernaculars as being able to be centralized in the notion of development. And just to link to Daniel, who's going to speak next, I think doing this is very important if we stop, if we find a way to stop reinventing development instead of changing it. And I believe looking into the past to how these notions, concepts, shaping development developed, and how we can improve them or overhaul them, whatever we think we can do, is very important. Not only understanding how these have developed over time and traveled across different contexts, and the archives then become very important in achieving this goal, because this is where we can actually measure, from where we can research and measure the progress that has been made, or the kind of reconfigurations that are just superficial. On this note, I'll leave the floor to Daniel Millum, who got you introduced earlier.
Thanks very much.
Over to you, Daniel.
Great, good segue. Thanks very much, Melz. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Great, fantastic, thank you. So hi everybody, my name's Danny and I'm one of the project officers working on the current Wellcome funded 3-year project to catalogue, promote and preserve the British Library for Development Studies legacy collection. And the BLDS collection is located in the basement of the Institute of Development Studies, and it tracks the unfolding story of international development and health systems in the global south over the last half century. The collection is one of the most comprehensive in the entire world for coverage of government and official sources, and particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s. And so, from our research into its history, the BLDS collection appears in many ways to be a fascinating mirror of the ongoing debates within international development as to the direction of the discipline. So the collection also reflects the nature of IDS and therefore the library's role as it was designed and built up as a working library to support the research interests of those seeking a deeper understanding of international development. So when IDS was founded in 1966, it was recognised that the Institute needed to include a first-class library with an emphasis on collecting materials from the developing countries themselves. And from 1966 to 1996, BLDS built up a comprehensive collection using labour-intensive methods to acquire material from developing country sources, notably including grey literature and project documentation. So around 60% of the material in the former IDS library originated from the global south. And that proportion is actually much higher within the BLDS legacy collection, because the entirety of the government publication section pretty much comprises material from the countries of origin. So this is fertile territory to explore the questions that Melz raises around ideas of Western modernity, epistemology and decolonizing development from an archival and special collections perspective. So if we start from the premise that IDS was very much at the centre of the evolution of ideas of development and development studies, to what extent can we find evidence of this in the collections? And to what extent does it support the argument that development continued and continues to carry discourses and representations with colonial origins? So the origin of IDS lay in the 1963 Committee on Training in Public Administration for Overseas Countries under Lord Bridges, which recommended the setting up of a special institution in the UK for research, documentation and teaching for top-level training in administration and colonial, post-colonial countries. Its objectives comprised the advancement of education and learning, in particular to establish, maintain and conduct in any part of the world an institute or institutes to identify and study problems arising both within the United Kingdom and abroad concerning economic and social development and administration. So as such, there's no need for us to look for a continuing colonial subtext. It's completely out in the open here. In the words of founder Dudley Sears, an efficient and honest public service was still believed to be a necessary, almost sufficient condition for economic growth and social progress. And he added, unspoken perhaps was the thought that a place of training in Britain was necessary to maintain British influence overseas. So I thought it might be interesting to have a look from the collection itself here at an example and to see the extent to which it reflects this idea. So I had a delve through the Ghana holdings. There are over 200 boxes of Ghanaian material, all of which we've now catalogued. And 4 things struck me as potentially relevant and perhaps constituting gradations of coloniality or different manifestations of its impact. So the first was the use of problematic metadata. So you take this record, for instance, for the report of Commission on Native Courts from 1951, and this is still catalogued on the downloadable external record as Ghana Native Races, despite this term having been retired in favour of Indigenous Peoples Ghana. Obviously, these were changes that we then made ourselves on the catalogue. So that's example 1. Then moving on, the second is the material originating from the Gold Coast pre-independence. So there's a whole swathe of publications from the colonial government along the following lines, which we can see here. And here we can see that the collections and the holdings are reflecting the transition to, the preparation for, and the shaping of the end of the formal colonial period. The third was the segue from material from the Gold Coast colony to independent Ghana. So we have holdings of annual reports for various departments that transfer smoothly across to the new state. So we can look here and we've got a whole bunch of Gold Coast subsequently becoming Ghana departments, forestry department, income tax department, labour department, all of which then go and map onto their equivalent departments in Ghana post-independence. An example of the actual item there. And so this begs all manner of fascinating questions, which perhaps have been long answered by historians, as to the continuity of personnel and the persistence of structures and administrative procedures and processes. Again, maybe not fascinating, but certainly interesting and relevant as well. Just as an aside, on this same lines, I wrote a short blog about the same sort of continuity that you can find between airline annual reports which move from the Rhodesian to the Zimbabwean regimes, which you can find here. Again, you would see potentially this as being a huge point of rupture in the history of a particular country in Africa. And yet the continuity of text and in some instances of images as well, or even of typefaces, is really, really remarkable and striking. Fourth point on Ghana, finally, I was struck by the extent to which the holdings consists of stuff like development plans, censuses, and other statistics. So just from the Central Bureau of Statistics alone, we've got the following. And you can see here, prison statistics, national income of Ghana, statistical handbook of the Republic of Ghana, etc., etc. And when you combine this with the lengthy censuses that we hold as well, which take up shelves and shelves of the collection for 1960, for 1970, and for 1984, this means that a huge proportion of the holdings are devoted to quantitative measurement. So this is obviously part of the remit of the library and the institute, but it's interesting in historical terms to see the fact that this is not a 1960s, 1970s economic-oriented approach, which then goes out of fashion, because even in the 5-year collection policy from 1993, which is trying to reduce the amount collected per country, they stress a basic core of government publications for each country should be acquired, say the development plan, the budget, the national account, statistical yearbook, the all-country population census results. And as the BLDS collection largely ends in the 1990s, we can thus assume that these quantitative principles are present throughout. And one can already see, I think, how this fits into the critiques that today's seminar is trying to address, that Western capitalist conceptions of progress and modernity, underpinned by measurable objective quantitative factors, provide the basis of the development agenda even throughout its post-colonial progressive turn. And given the move in recent years to development funds being increasingly allocated by the likes of PricewaterhouseCoopers, one can only imagine that this statistic-led methodology is likely to be even more ascendant. As a further aside here, I would note there's also a whole separate archive at IDS devoted to participatory development. That falls outside the BLDS legacy collection. And there, in this context, perhaps it's interesting to think how different types of development approach require and produce different types of library or collection, which manifest the impact of coloniality differently. Anyway, trying to get back on track. Is it a bit reductive to talk about measurement without looking at what it is that's being measured? There's a great article from last year by Stephen Masakura, thanks to Paul Gilbert, if you're here, for pointing this out to me, on Dudley Sears, the Institute for Development Studies, and the fracturing of international development thought in the 1960s and 1970s. And Masakura, if I'm not misparaphrasing him, recounts how Sears began with a focus on national income accounting, but gradually, because of his very expertise in statistics, came to doubt both the data collection statistics that were being used by development economists and the policies that politicians pursued as a result of them. As this relates to our discussion today, basically Sears was there. He was advising the Labour government on implementing aid packages to former colonial dependencies, and then he moves to found IDS in 1966. And it's just at this point in the late 60s, just as the BLDS collection and its collection policies are initially being shaped, that Sears and others come to criticise the imposition of Western economic categories such as unemployment, which are not relevant to conditions on the ground, as he saw it. So I guess for the purposes of our discussion here, again, we're seeing a transition from direct colonialism through post-colonial economic growth as the object of development along the Western model, and then from there to a more complex understanding of social realities and a model of generating gainful employment, reducing inequalities and fulfilling basic needs. And Masakura stresses this didn't mean a turn away from statistical analysis or quantitative methods, but a move towards alternative measures such as literacy rates, educational attainment, and life expectancy, with Sears eventually moving to set up what he called active life profiles that relied on available health data to compare countries as different as the United Kingdom, India, Brazil, and Malaysia. So in terms of relevance for us, we need to ask again, is this reflected in the collection? And I'm just actually in the process of cataloguing Malaysia. And in terms of what we were just suggesting before, there are certainly a whole bunch of varied and specific public health related reports from Malaysia from the 1970s, of which I've listed a few here. So we can see potentially here the influence of Sears's further developments of his ideas and therefore of the different potential owners of collection and interest within the archive. As with everything that I'm instancing here, it's probably best to treat this as an exploratory test case rather than hard evidence. But at the very least, this doesn't disprove the theory that closer study of the collection will allow us to study the imprint of development trends and therefore also help us substantiate the claim that development can be viewed as a project that supports coloniality in all of its forms. I just wanted to share a final snapshot with you, which relates to Gautier's question for the session concerning problematic discourses and representations that have colonial origins. I want to do this by returning to the search term Indigenous peoples and comparing the types of BLDS items that it produces and the versions of coloniality that these manifest. So, for instance, we have here, first of all, the touristic, exotic othering masquerading as anthropology in such items as The Man and His Ways. This is an introduction to the customs and beliefs of Rhodesia's African people. And this is dated 1969 and was thus produced by and under a post-colonial apartheid white settler regime. But this isn't unique to Rhodesia's UDI regime, though. A similar angle is also taken by the Zambian government commissioned The Tribes of Zambia, which is from 1965. And then there are also, I've listed here just a few more examples of reports that take up issues seen to be particular to Indigenous groups. For instance, from Kenya, the report of a working party on African land tenure. From Botswana, the native land problem in the Tati district. And Thailand, a general background and guidelines to educate Thai Hill tribe groups. And here, I guess you were getting some interesting examples of potentially how Indigenous groups are treated similarly, both by actual colonial governments, in the case of pre-independence Kenya and Botswana, and by the government of a country that was never formally colonized, Thailand. So again, I guess this is potential evidence from the collection of the impact of coloniality as something separate from colonialism. So to conclude, the analysis of the BLDS legacy collection and IDS collection policy suggests some support for the argument that even later iterations of development are still dependent on theories of knowledge and worldviews that have their roots in colonialism. But these are merely fragments and suggestions of possible avenues of exploration. And it would be fantastic to have people taking on board the philosophical insights and directions indicated by Melz and applying them to the concrete collection by using it as primary source material for their own research. So just let us know if you're interested in doing so. Details are here and we can arrange a visit. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Melz and Daniel, for really fascinating and very insightful presentations on, fundamental questions. First of all, can development move beyond this legacy? And I agree that there is really a fundamental question whether it's possible or not, given that it's really built on coloniality. And thanks a lot, Daniel, for showing us how the archive, the role that the archive has in tracking the history of these problematic representations and notions, which are still very much embedded within the language of development or within conceptions that are very much used today in development. You gave the example of an employment. Melz, you spoke about conceptions of time and modernity, which are still very much embedded in a lot of the discourse and thinking around development. So it's very important to use the archive and to use it as a way to trace the history of these problematic conceptions, to embed a critical lens in the research and teaching that we're doing today, and in the learning as well, of course. I just wanted to bounce back on that and give an example of current research being done at IDS, a project that I've worked on, as an example of how problematic conceptions are still very much alive and continue today. This is in relation to the Batwa populations of Central Africa, which are otherwise known as pygmies. This term is a very loaded term, so I won't be using it. It's a very problematic term, the term pygmy. But these are autochthonous or indigenous populations of Central Africa. And in a recent project on educational marginalization in Central Africa, we've been working with these populations in the province of Tanganyika in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a province that has been affected by large-scale violent conflict, on which there is relatively little research or media attention. It's very much a polarized context because it's an ongoing violent conflict. And what we found as we did the research was that the reductionist, racist, and simplificatory discourses and views about the Batwa populations were extremely prevalent. They were prevalent in the academic research that had been produced on those populations. They were prevalent in policy documents as well. They were also prevalent on the ground there in Tanganyika in the interviews that we did, and very much to a certain extent within ourselves as well. And so as part of that research project, we tried to trace the genealogy of these problematic conceptions. They do have colonial origins. Melz was talking about epistemicide. The Batwa populations of Central Africa were very much affected by the colonial epistemicide, and they were very much considered to be the most backward within the hierarchies of races, the very problematic, of course, hierarchies of races that were established during the colonial era. But importantly as well, there were traces of racism within Bantu societies. So the racism that exists today against Batwa populations is not just a colonial legacy, it's also interlocks and interweaves with other forms of racism against those populations. So as we do research today, and this is thinking, as we do research or as we learn or as we teach today, it's very important to not consider that the tools that we have for empirical research are sufficient in and of themselves to address these problematic conceptions. They can also, the tools themselves, as Daniel has highlighted, can also be problematic. What's important is, of course, to maintain a critical view. And importantly, just to finish on that, even within ourselves, so within the research team, which was composed of Congolese researchers and researchers based at IDS, there was a lingering idea, which wasn't immediately considered to be problematic, was that these Batwa populations and their societies represented more pristine societies, or societies that were better connected to the forest. So this idea that they were closer to the forest and less corrupted to a certain extent by capitalism and imperialism. And that is an idea that is very prevalent, has been very prevalent in anthropology, in environmental sciences, in ecological activism, that indigenous societies are closer to nature. I'm here using a lot of quotes in what I'm saying, but it's also very problematic in that it often denies the historicity of those societies as well. So it considers that while the world has changed and been affected by all these changes, capitalism, imperialism, and all of that, there are these societies that somehow remained in a more kind of pristine stage, and that is problematic in and of itself. It's an ethnographic myth, and it's a way to deny the historicity of those societies and deny the fact that they as well changed in history. So that was just an example, of how we're still continuing, of course, to grapple with these very problematic legacies which continue today. But at this stage, I would like to invite people to ask questions. So we're going to be taking questions through the Q&A chat box, and invite, of course, everyone to think critically about these representations and discourses, to explore the origins and genealogy through the archive or other tools, and to follow Mel's invitation to think radically about new imaginations and new imaginaries. So I'm going to move to the chat box, and we have a first question, I think, to Melz. I'll read it quite quickly. I would be interested, so this is a question from Dominic Glover. Thank you for your question. I would be interested to hear Melz expand on how they have situated Westernness in an intrinsic relationship to modernity and colonialism. That being so, how should we think in contemporary terms about the developmental practices and discourses of the countries such as China and Brazil in their interventions in Africa? Are those practices also developmental, colonial, or modern? If so, they're in fact even Western in spite of being Chinese, Brazilian, respectively, or are they something other than colonial, modern, and Western?
Thank you very much for that really interesting question. And there's a number of ways that I could come to it. One thing I do want to say is, firstly, basing it in how limited language is, in the sense that coloniality, development, this intrinsic relationship to Westernness. Like, I use the term Westernness. What even is Westernness? Or I didn't use the term Westernness, I used the term the West. And so what even is the West? And I feel like a lot of these, or even what is the global North, what is the global South, like all of these things need to be complicated. And so thank you for that complication. But for me, it all rests in this knowledge system that is essentially which is essentially based within like European philosophy. And so I think where the distinction may be as well is that development is often, as far as I understand it, a discipline that's more focused on practicality. And so I liked what was said earlier about development as being a route to assist others in times of catastrophe. And I thought that was a really beautiful reflection of like the things that development does, which are beneficial to society. But then when we are in like practical movement, it doesn't give us enough time to step back and think about the theory and think about what are the logics that are underpinning all of the actions that we take. And that's where I often come to the conversation from. And so if we move out of this kind of practical, what is happening, what needs to be, what this urgency almost in terms of solving global problems, and we reflect on a theory that underpins the logics of how we solve these problems, would see how many of the ways in which we address global problems may ameliorate some of the problems we're trying to address, but then in the same way, create their own problems. And so when it comes to Chinese or Brazilian involvement in Africa. It's not something that I have much of like an intellectual view of. I'm somebody from Ghana, and I've seen some of the things that are happening, which are often, well, from the perspective that I've been able to see it, like there are a few quite problematic things happening, especially even just racism that happens in these moves towards development. People within their own countries experiencing like very high levels of racism. And so I would say that Eurocentrism as a knowledge system, and even if we can call it Eurocentrism, we're using the English language, it's always going to be limited. But Eurocentrism within a knowledge system, can be reproduced in whatever body. And even as I sit here and speak to you, all of us have been schooled and taught within the logics of white supremacy. I'm doing my PhD at one of the bastions of like the empire. And there's no way that the things that I say, the things that I do are not gonna in some way replicate the system in which I am a part of. And as well, the system in which gives me like housing, that gives me food, that gives me like, do you know what I mean? And so all of these things, it's a very, very complicated matrix of things that we're dealing with. And so at the heart of my provocation is to suggest that we all need to take a step back and consider what are the logics that we are working with? How has Eurocentrism infiltrated all of our minds? And how are we going to ameliorate global problems, not in an immediate way, not in an urgent way, but how can we reflect on how society could be entirely different so there are no more global problems for us to fix? I hope that answers the question.
Thanks a lot. Junodor, did you want to react to that? Otherwise, I'll be taking further questions that are coming in.
Well, I think Mel has provided a very good answer to this question. And just on the Chinese and other interventions in Africa, I'm tempted to say that one of the things that we can take away from today is that there is a fundamental difference between what development is meant to be and what it has been hijacked to become. And development, just like colonization, could be a front for different kinds of interventions in Africa. Presenting these interventions is maybe exporting values like the French with their civilizing mission in Africa, or the Chinese today, like helping with indebting governments, African governments, to the extent that they probably will not be able to pay back these debts. So I think if we look at other powerful nations, other powerful countries intervening in Africa today, it's not very different in terms of using development or using aid as a pretext to pursue geopolitical agendas or just ambitions to dominate other parts of the world.
Thanks. So I'm going to take more questions. So there is a remark in the chat box by Mariko, and thanks a lot for that one. So that's not a direct question. So I'm going to have a look at the chat box. Has a tool to measure how much knowledge around development is colonial still been developed? So maybe I'll read out just a few questions because we have limited time and these are quite complex questions. So maybe I'll read out a few and then Daniel and Melz, if you want to react. So yes, so there's this question: has a tool to measure how much knowledge around development is colonial still been developed? Not that I know of. by Laila, does the panel think the term development is still relevant given the historical legacies of coloniality and colonialism? It's a big question for us at the Institute of Development Studies, and something that I ask myself regularly when I convene the module on ideas of development. That is really a fundamental question and a complex one to answer. I'll take a last one. How do you balance the dependency of developing countries on developed countries for financing and the needs for rediscovering the lost values of shaping development? Whose role should it be to decolonize, and how do you strike the balance and honesty in terms of commitment to decolonize? So Melz or Daniel, would you like to react to those questions?
I think most of them are probably more in Melz's wheelhouse than mine, but I would say just from the question about a tool to measure how much knowledge around development is colonial still, I think that that's possibly where study in the archive and of the collection would be really helpful, because for a researcher to be there in depth and to see what has been collected, what has not been collected, what the originating organizations and institutions are that it came from, which institutions, again, have been missed out there. All of that, I think, is going to give an indication of what form of coloniality is infusing that development process, and also gives you the opportunity, just coming on to a question you didn't read out there, of potentially contrasting some of the different countries. So we've got great collections there from the Anglophone sphere, but also from the Francophone sphere. That's quite rare, I think, to have in one collection. So it would be great to run some sort of cross comparison there and see the types of material and the language that's used there and the ideas that are put across there of development. So yeah, over to you, Melz, for some of the other more theoretical questions.
Amazing, thank you. And I guess even with that first question about tools to understand what is colonial and what's not colonial, I even question whether that is possible. And from the position of how pervasive coloniality is. And I know a lot of the responses, or even my presentation, just kind of leave us at a place of what do we do then? Because this is all we know. And that just shows how much the knowledge system is us. It lives within us. And it's what we've been taught. It's what keeps us safe as well. And so the idea to begin imagining something otherwise is terrifying. And then as well, is development as a term still useful? I can't say yes or no. Well, I can actually. For me, it's a difficult one. I probably would say that it is a very problematic term. And I think one of the most problematic aspects of it is that it has this insidious way of legitimizing the West. Or the West, we all know what I'm trying to say. And in that sense, if we say other countries are underdeveloped, the West is developed, it gives this inherent sense of, one, superiority, and two, legitimacy over the state of the countries like the one in which we live right now. And these countries shouldn't have that level of legitimacy. And I think when we begin to complicate this word development, it also allows us to further complicate these nations in which are essentially awful. And then the other question about, sorry, we are running out of time as well. Whose job is it to decolonize, and a question about money. One reflection I did have on that is just about how reparations as a concept, as a movement, is something that I still find very interesting, even though it's often disregarded. And the financial dependency of developing countries on developed countries only comes from the pillage of developing countries. If it was flipped the other way, given even within the reigns of capitalism, given natural resources and so on, situation would be very, very different. And so how can we engage in movements that allow us to complicate this idea of how money flows through development?
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to read out a last set of questions, and I apologize in advance that I don't think we'll be able to cover all the questions and comments because there are quite a few and they're also quite dense questions. So I'll take the question by Joshua Isan. I would like to know if there are noticeable differences between Anglophone and Francophone Africa in the understanding of development. In essence, do we say that perceptions of development are dependent on who the colonialists are or were, English, French, or otherwise? Dionodor, maybe you would like to react to that question, given that Cameroon has been in the middle of these spheres of colonialism. I'll take just two more. Do the panelists have case studies to share of current projects or movements that challenge westernized paradigms and welcome diverse plural perspectives? I'll give a quick answer to this one. The Connected Sociologies project at the University of Sussex, which is led by Professor Gurminder Bambra, is really fascinating in that regard and has an open archive and also modules that are being developed live. So that's an excellent resource for that. And please, if people have other suggestions, put them in the chat so that, resources with that regard, in that regard. And a question by Sorab or Aurora, a question for all, but perhaps firstly for Melz. I appreciate the call for free imagination in shaping alternative possibilities, but I'm wondering about this term imagination. Where is it located? What gives rise to it? And how is it performative? So if Daniel and Melz, you would like to react to those, that would be great. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll have that much time to answer the other questions, but I'll try to put in resources in the chat. Thanks.
I've just got a really quick example of not a current like project challenging westernized paradigms, but just a really interesting kind of idea that we came across in looking through the journals part of the BLDS collection, where there's a whole bunch of journals from West Africa there. And a researcher came across and found from the 1970s a bunch of Sierra Leone IT-based computing journals. And it just seemed like a really fascinating example of an alternative modernity. There's an idea that these ideas are just starting in the West, or whatever we want to call it, and then permeate out to people who are behind. But this was like a parallel development and all manner of ideas that were kind of like ahead of their time or just different. And I guess one of the arguments there could be, well, just the very conception of kind of technological development is infused with Western coloniality in itself, but there's definitely, say, examples within the archive of how there were independent sources of thought on this in a bunch of different countries, which are sort of written out of that history in the longer term, and will be interesting again to find out more about.
Okay, shall I go? So yeah, in terms of case study, similarly, I was looking for a quote in a book, but I can't find it right now. But there's a book called The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, where by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. And there's a quote in it which says, the more we tear things down, the more we're able to see. And so I feel often like there is like looking back and seeing what we can garner from what has happened like in the past and how we can bring that to the future, almost like Sankofa, which is a Ghanaian kind of proverb where we look back and to look forward. But in this situation of like Western modernity that we're in, the things that happened in the past weren't under the kind of spotlight of Western modernity. And so what happens in the future, I feel also has to be different. And so as we begin to go on this journey of exploring a world outside coloniality, exploring a mindset outside coloniality, the more we do, the more we'll be able to see. And so it's even something that's inherent within the knowledge system of Eurocentrism, that before we embark on something, we must hypothesize the outcome. And what happens when we don't hypothesize the outcome? What happens when we trust and begin to move forward, not knowing what's on the other side, but trusting that something different may possibly be there? And then this point about imagination, hopefully that answer kind of also speaks to this idea of imagination. And it would be interesting for me to know the logics behind kind of that question. But for me, imagination is literally just the possibility to imagine beyond. It's in a way the antithesis of the kind of scientific culture within like the Western Academy. It's almost childish in a sense that children can dream, they can chat nonsense, and they can just believe it. And what happens when we start applying this kind of childlike inquiry to the work that we do? What happens when we consider there's a whole body of work looking at how social justice work is science fiction? And so people like Adrienne Marie Brown, people like Octavia Butler have like crafted this beautiful canon of knowledge that looks at how we can consider like the future as a speculative route of inquiry. And so how do we not begin with like the possibilities based in like this kind of third dimension, this very hard science way? How do we speculate? How do we create science fiction? And also based on the idea of complete liberation on the timeline that we're going on is almost an impossibility, if not an impossibility. And so therefore we have to dream up the impossible. And that's what imagination is to me.
Junodo, I can see that you have your hand raised. Please go ahead. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I apologize for those who had questions which we couldn't answer, but we need to stick to time. But Junodo, please go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Gautier. I think the fact that time has flown by so quickly shows that this topic is very interesting, and the discussions we've had here today can just be like conversation starters for the time to come. The issue of decolonizing development is very important because, as we've seen, it covers important issues that are happening now, even if the tendency to link coloniality in development is to see as something of the past and that modernity can easily do away with. So I would like to thank Melz very much for their contribution to this event, and thanking James as well for organizing, and thanking Daniel for bringing in the archival aspect and speaking about the importance of archives in tracing coloniality in development. And also my co-chair, Gautier, thank you very much. And thank you all those who've attended and have asked very insightful questions. Hopefully we'll have other occasions to discuss this topic again. And I wish you all the good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheerio.